Welcome to Black Belt Selling with Stephanie and Anna Scheller. I'm Anna.
And I'm Stephanie.
We are a mother-daughter team who are passionate about helping you grow your business by learning how to close more sales. On Black Belt Selling, we bring in guests as well as present content that helps you to kick through the obstacles that are keeping you from making more money. You can learn more about us by going to our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Black Belt Selling. There you'll find motivational quotes, blogs, but more importantly, you'll find out when our shows go live so that you can listen to the great content we bring and you can be inspired, but most of all, you can get information that's going to help you to grow your business. So go to facebook.com/groups/Black Belt Selling. And I'm excited to introduce to you today Tibor Shanto. Tibor, did I say your last name right? I got your first name, I know.
Yeah, no, you did good.
Okay, awesome, awesome. Tibor is from Toronto, Canada, which I learned is the center of the universe. Thank you for sharing that with us. We needed that information. And he is a 25-year veteran of business-to-business sales. And Tibor's going to share with us how he got into sales. And it's a very interesting story. It's probably a story a lot of us share. But he's developed insider's hands-on perspective of successful sales execution. He is a brilliant sales tactician, and he shows organizations and sales professionals how to leverage their sales process to shorten sales cycles, increase close ratios, don't we all want that, and create double-digit growth through execution and using the right combination, strategy, tools, and metrics, as well as execution of the sales process. He's the principal and sales performance leader of Renbor Sales Solutions. You received the 2014 Gold Medal for Top Sales and Marketing Webinars. Wow. And is one of the top 30 salespeople in the world on Forbes.com. So
Wow.
Perk up, guys, because we've got some fabulous information here coming in. So, Tibor, thank you for joining us from the center of the universe.
Thank you very much for having me. Just a slight correction, that list was published on Forbes.com, but it was sponsored by somebody else, but Forbes was the one that presented it. So, but I was on the list. I was number 8.
Wow. Well, I mean,
that works for me.
I've got to say, every single day it seems like we're getting more and more sales and business royalty on this show, and I think you definitely fall under that category, Tibor. So I am curious. Mom mentioned you have a great story about how you got started in sales. So why don't we start there?
Yeah, so it goes back to the mid-'80s, early '80s, where I got a tip on a stock, and I went out and bought the stock, and didn't become wealthy overnight, but made a good load of money overnight. About a week later, I got a tip from the same guy, but this time I ended up giving back everything I gained the week before and then some. And it struck me that there's got to be more to this than meets the eye. And I found out that in order to take my license up here in Toronto, you needed to be sponsored by a firm that was registered. And about the only way to get into those firms at the time was through sales. So wanting the license more than having the fear of the sales, I took the job. And that was my first foray. I would argue from there, I sort of wanted to get away from sales because I had a similar conception or misconception that a lot of people do out there about sales and selling. But every position that I ended up taking somehow drew me further and further to sales. And then finally, in around 1990, I decided that if we're going to do it, let's do it right, and committed fully to it, and have been evolving ever since. And then about 13 years ago, went out on my own to do what I call professional development for professional salespeople.
Huh.
So if the second stock would have made me money, you never know what would have happened, but it didn't.
That's how that always works. It's one little divergence in the road that that takes you there. I think that's awesome though. That this I want this thing was what kind of drove you past that, because a lot of people are scared of sales and selling and being in sales. So for me, that's just kind of cool. So tell me, what's this thing I'm seeing here on my list? Something about shift. What is shift, Tibor?
Shift is a book that I co-wrote with somebody back in, well, it came out in 2010. We probably wrote it in the latter part of '08 and '09, just at the height of the economic recession. Good timing on our part, anyway.
Yeah.
So, the core elements of the book came from my co-author, and he had always been fixated with this notion of trigger events. So the book looks at how trigger events come into sales, and the title of it was Shift for some reason that I can't remember, but I guess we were shifting people's view of things. I also think that, one thing you learn about co-authoring a book is that it's a lesson in compromise. I always tell people it's a lot like marriage without the nocturnal, benefits. So, so I think shift was one of my concessions, but that doesn't change the content.
So it's been a little while since shift. Then what has changed, or actually, better question, what still applies? Because sometimes people think that we've always got to do the new thing, the top. We always got to be at the beginning thing, and that's not always the case. So what still applies for you since shift? But then what things have kind of progressed and changed as, the past 7 years have gone past?
So I think that if you're in sales, you should read Shift, and you can borrow it from the library. It's not for the royalties, because I think there is some solid fundamentals that are in there that I think if you're, I just had somebody today from LinkedIn who's quite a sales professional, and they were quite complimentary about the book. I think the challenge for me with the book, and again, so I agree with you, we're not here to say here's the latest, greatest, but things evolve, and the more you get into things, the more you uncover things, and the more you learn, and as a result of that, you can apply different things. And I think, again, as a primer, as a starter, if you will, I think Shift is great because it gets people to think in certain ways, and it gets them to think about the trigger events and so on. But once the book was out and I began to go, okay, what's the next adventure? How do I build on this? I began to do a lot of exploring around a couple of things that have gotten me to, excuse the pun, shift my thinking. And the two things are, one is I started looking into, around 2010, I started looking into this notion of customer loyalty. And my goal was, if you can take elements of customer loyalty and infuse them earlier in the sales cycle. So if I knew why somebody decided to stay with me for 10 years, and I can pack that into my prospecting and I could pack that into my sales cycle, then I would get the same benefit that loyal customers give, or you would get a shorter sales cycle. But there's some benefit to understanding loyalty and how it might be applied, or how some of those nerves can be touched earlier. And one of the things that became glaringly clear, and there's quite a bit of studies, quite a body of studies that validate this, is that satisfaction is not really a proxy for loyalty. So if you look at, we get all these surveys after we do a transaction. You can set your clock by GoDaddy, because when you get off the phone with their customer service, within about 90 seconds, you'll get a customer survey. And what they're looking for is they're looking for you to say you're satisfied. But, or they want you to be a recommender and all that. But studies have shown, there's one that I looked at, there's two guys out there called Bell and Patterson. They have a book out called Customer Loyalty Guaranteed. And one of the things that came out of that book for me that caught my eye and got me to look further was this notion that they did a survey, and about 75% of people who switched from one vendor to another, so they went from, let's say, Verizon to AT&T, 75% of them said that they were satisfied or completely satisfied at the time that they switched. And so again, it just pokes a big hole in this notion of satisfaction being a prerequisite for switching, and it's not. And once you accept that, once you look at that, then the whole notion of window dissatisfaction becomes iffy or fuzzy. Now, again, I think if you read it, it'll help you open up and so forth, but there's going to become a point when you're a runner. At first, running a 5 kilometer is great, but then you figure out how to do 10 kilometers and eventually you're doing marathons. So it's the same thing in sales. So I think, as I say, I think people should read it because even if they just grasp the window of dissatisfaction, it'll drive their thinking. But once you accept the fact that satisfaction doesn't correlate to loyalty, then all of a sudden there's this big wide world of how do I get satisfied customers to switch. So what were these genius salespeople focused on that got people who were satisfied or completely satisfied to abandon where they were? So they gave up on the loyalty, they were satisfied, and they switched. So in essence, they bypassed the window of dissatisfaction. So if you were completely stuck on, trigger events, you would have missed it because there would have been no event because the salesperson would have gotten the deal. The other element that began to sort of influence me is this notion of a trigger event. So triggers are not new. I forget the guy's name, but he did the blue glasses, the sunglasses. He was an advertising guy. He talked about triggers back in the 70s. I forget what the name of the book is. It's Sugarman, I think his name is. But anyway, so what you begin to look at is, so in theory, you have this event that triggers a reaction from the buyer, and then you can capitalize on that reaction. That's watering it down a lot, but when they read it, and again, I emphasize they should read it, they'll see that there's a bit more to it. But in essence, if you will, an event triggers a reaction, so a company gets financed. You have somebody, VP of sales leaves, so that triggers an opportunity for me to go and talk to his replacement. I could follow her to the new company that she goes to. So that's all well and good, but in essence, if you look at it in the clear light of day, what we're telling our readers to do is to wait for an event. I'm not the kind of guy that likes to wait for outside factors to impact my success. I'm hands-on. I like to be more in control. And what began to strike me is the important thing in the equation is not the event and not the trigger, but the buyer's response to the event, because that's what we're capitalizing on, right? So it's the buyer's response to the event that's going to drive their willingness to interact, their willingness to make a purchase, their willingness to make a change, and so on. So again, another example of triggers, let's say regulatory change, right? So when there's a regulatory change, that triggers a number of things in industries that offer openings to salespeople, but you're still dependent on that event taking place. So the question then becomes is how can I spark or initiate the same reaction without having to wait for the event? And then the question I ask people is, would you rather wait at a bus stop with a bunch of other salespeople waiting for the same bus taking you to the same destination, or would you rather get in an Uber and get there early and eat all the things yourself? And again, so I think most salespeople would rather get in the Uber and get there ahead of the crowd. Yeah. So the other thing I began to explore is how these people initiated this conversation with ostensibly, people who were satisfied. So one of the elements in the book that I would disassociate myself from is this notion that people who are status quo don't buy or can't be engaged. I disprove that theory every day because I reach out to people who are ostensibly status quo, who are not in the market, who are not looking, who are not consuming any social media. They're just head down doing their work, but you can approach them with a narrative that focuses more on their objectives as opposed to their dissatisfaction. So that's the two areas that have changed that, again, I think the book stands up, but I would look at it as a primer that, gets you looking at other things. But those are the two things. Satisfaction is not a proxy for loyalty. Therefore, the window of dissatisfaction falls by the wayside. And the other is, do you want to wait with everybody else, or would you rather trigger the event, would you rather trigger the reaction so you can capitalize it before the crowd? Because everybody who's read the book is now hip to trigger events, right?
Well, and that's a really interesting perspective because there's lots of reasons that people say they're satisfied. Maybe they just don't want to change. There's no reason for them to consider anything differently. And what you're talking about is maybe introducing new reasons for them based on getting to know a customer that to spark that reaction.
If you look at most prospecting calls, they basically have a simple pattern of we solve this pain. Do you have this pain? Because if you have this pain, we can solve it, right?
Right.
Whereas, so if you look at the segment of the market that's status quo, which is a fairly large segment in most industries, if you were to reach out to someone, whether through social, telephone, or otherwise, and say, hey, this is the pain we cure, do you have this pain? 70% of the people are going to respond, no, they don't, not because they wouldn't be interested in your product, but the way you frame the question. But if you call that same person who doesn't have the pain and framed your introduction around objectives and business impacts that similar companies to them have been able to achieve with your offering, then I would argue those same 70% would engage with you. Not every single one, but there are more in the 70%. And personally, I'd rather be, the only fish in a big pool than have a whole bunch of concentration around people in pain who are looking for a discount.
Yeah. Anna, did you?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that's a very creative approach rather than a competitive approach. Creating the opportunity to help somebody versus fighting with everybody else to provide the solution that everybody else is worried about or everybody thinking about. That's wow.
The interesting thing is most salespeople will talk about solutions, but if you look it up in the dictionary, solution is solving somebody's problem, but most of the time they couldn't articulate what problem they're solving. So they're a solution running around the countryside looking for a problem. And I think customers are beginning to see through that.
And I think that has and we haven't really talked much about it. It's, also an old concept that we talk about what you focus on expands. And I think that's a great point in that, if you're focused on finding problems, this is why you have some salespeople who are constantly having trouble closing deals because they're so focused on problems, they end up creating problems. I like the idea of coming at it with that more creative side. Now, you'd mentioned the triggers thing earlier, and that one I've done some research in, but it's still relatively new to me. First of all, if you could explain them very briefly for anyone in our audience who doesn't know anything about them or is just learning like me, and then also talk about leveraging those to close more sales. What are your best tactics for that?
Well, there's different things. So triggers, clearly, as the name implies, something happens. Think of it as a tripwire or something like that. And that indicates to you that there's an opportunity that's opened up. So some simple examples would be that, you have a Google News alert for a particular company, and there is, they get some new round of financing, so everybody, boom, pounces on them because they figure they got cash, right? A different trigger would be a change in personnel. So the interesting thing is that what can you do with that? So if a VP of sales leaves, so if she leaves company A and goes to company B, in a sense, you have two opportunities because you can follow her to company B, plus you can talk to the replacement that replaces her at company A. But there's a third opportunity because that person will have to come from somewhere else, so they're going to have to be replaced as well. So that's an example where you can take one event that triggers three opportunities. Other things that you could do that trigger, that give you a head of the others is, for instance, we saw when we did the book, we saw some research that suggested that when there's a new CFO or VP of finance in place, they tend to deal with things like office supply contracts sometime after the first 9 months. In other words, in the first 9 months, they're digging into what they consider to be bigger things as opposed to smaller contracts. Not small to the supplier, but small from their point of view. So if, for instance, you find out that there is a new CFO in town, then if you're the incumbent, you got 9 months to fortify yourself. If you're an outsider, you got 9 months to plant seeds and get things ready. So when the time comes, you become their go-to favorite, or what in the book is referred to as the emotional favorite. I'll tell you one I use personally, and hopefully people will not take it. So far they haven't. So I have, for instance, an ad up on Monster. A resume up on Monster. Not because I'm looking for a job, but because every time somebody posts for a new salesperson, I get an email. And I get to call that company that day to say, what are you going to do to ramp this person up? Most trainers wait till the person's on board and so on. But again, here's a trigger. The trigger is the want ad. Well, it's going to take them 2 or 3 months to get that. But if I can get in there now and even help them with the hiring, then I'm putting myself in a much better position for the ultimate contract, which would be for me the training and the development. So there's little things like that that people can do in their own industry that will, again, the event will trigger something, and as a result of that, how you behave. So I think one of the things in the book that I think people should look at and adhere to is that you always have to be putting yourself in a position where you can take advantage of triggers. So I think one of the upsides of social media and certainly a lot of the tools that have come out around the CRM these days is you can be very specific and very targeted and very tight in the type of triggers that you're looking for. So I think that if people leverage the tools that are out there, they could get in front of the right people at the right time a fair number of times. Again, but to me, that limits the discussion to a small part of the market. And in the book, we talk about that, you know, we do realize that this focuses a lot on the window of dissatisfaction, but if you can capitalize on that, that's great. I guess what I'm saying is, again, if you take the attention away from the event and put it on the reaction, then there's a whole bunch of other ways that you might be able to trigger that reaction.
That's,
So, you know, one of my taglines is why wait, you know, like.
I agree. I definitely agree. I look to create the opportunity because, especially where I live, it's rather remote and it's not the center of the universe like Toronto is. And so,
not everybody can be the center of the universe. There's only one.
There you go, Tibor. So I have to look at the creating the opportunity, which means I have to engage more in education, more in helping people to see how I can, like you say, help them achieve objectives that they may not have considered other solutions for their objective, because we all tend to go down one railroad track when we're satisfied. So
yeah.
that's great.
One of my favorite sayings, and salespeople do have to think about it, is nobody budgets for pain. You know, I challenge you to go into any business plan that's being prepared now for the next fiscal year and show me a line item that says pain. Just the same way when you ask salespeople, who do you look for in a company, they go to decision maker. I've yet to see a directory that has the title of decision maker beside anybody's name. So people budget for objectives, right? They have these long-term plans. They want to expand their factory. They want to roll out more services and all that. That's what they budget for. Pain is a temporary irritant. Take a couple of aspirins. It's sort of managed. What do they do after that, right? And so I think, again, to me, if you can, and it takes work. I don't want to make it sound easy. You have to understand what some of those objectives are by role, by region. So taking an example, I bet you we can talk to a CFO in Texas who's in one industry and they'll have an entirely different view than a CFO in a slightly different industry up here in Toronto. So it's not a cookie cutter type thing. There's one of my dogs in the background now. You know, it's not a cookie cutter type of thing, and I think it does take work, but you can begin to put together patterns by reviewing all the deals that you're in. So again, one of the things in the book that I would say needs to be expanded is there's a lot of focus on doing why you're winning, but I think that there's a risk of creating somewhat of a tunnel vision because you're going to pursue those same things, and as the market shifts, if you excuse the pun, you may not shift in time with it, where if you also explore why you're losing deals in a thorough way, not in an ego-soothing way, oh, our price was too high, or, you know, but in a thorough way, you can begin, and then most importantly, deals that go to no decision. So we all have, depending which industry you're in, you know, up to a third of opportunities that go into the top of the pipe just never come out at the other end in the form of a loss or a win. So if you can review all those deals or good representative, statistically significant sample of those deals, you can begin to understand which objectives you actually help people achieve, what the impact was for their business, and how you can then parlay that story to the next customer or to the next prospect. So, you know, to me, if you're willing to put in the work, then I think the rewards are there.
So I'm really curious. Mama talked earlier that you, when she was reading your bio, and I may be jumping ahead here, and maybe totally off topic, but I've been like biting my tongue on this one. You talk about shortening the sales cycle. So what's your best tip for shortening the sales cycle?
So a couple of things. One is to actually have a plan. I think, there's a great book out there called The Hard Truth About Soft Selling. And I think that we have, as the book says, created a generation of professional visitors as opposed to salespeople, right? They come to visit. That's not my job. My job is to sell. So I think you have to have intent, you have to have purpose. That purpose has to be grounded in helping the customer achieve business impact. But, I have to have a purpose, and you have to bring that down to a meeting level. And what I find is too many people go to a meeting, they'll have some traction, they'll have a good conversation, but they don't put the next thing on the table. They don't have a next step. So they'll leave the meeting. And this was something that was driven into me when I was younger. So, when you leave the meeting, or I'll call you back next Tuesday, you end up playing voicemail tag for a week. Eventually you do reconnect, but now you've just unnecessarily added a week to your cycle. I think the other thing that salespeople need to get comfortable with is that there's a lot of talk in the business about qualifying, right? Everybody wants to qualify. But, people, human beings generally tend to find what they're looking for. So I think what they should look for is to disqualify. Because if your closing average, for instance, is 4 to 1, so 1 out of every 4 people that you engage with will close, the reality is the quicker you get rid of the 3 that don't close, the more time and attention and focus you can have on the one that is going to close, which means you're going to shorten your cycle. So a couple of simple ways is, again, I think you need to have a plan. I think you need to have something significant for the customer. If they're not willing to move, then they're going to take their time. So unless you can show them how this will actually get them to where they want to go, they're going to bide their time. They're going to wait for other opportunities to come by. But on a tactical level, which is what it comes down to, is, again, what's your plan for that meeting? So going into that meeting, what's your plan A, what's your plan B, and what's your plan C? Each of those is a next step or something that takes you further into the sale. Each of those plan A, plan B, plan C should have a set of questions around it based on experiences that you've had with other customers. And again, when I say questions, I don't mean that you always have to interview or interrogate the customer. But you can leverage, again, one of the advantages of being able to talk about objectives you've been able to help other companies achieve is you can talk about it. I don't know what it's like over here, but over there at XYZ, they were facing this challenge. Here's what we brought to the table, and this was the outcome. So now the prospect can see themselves in this similar scenario, especially if XYZ is in a similar industry, similar challenges, and so on. So I think if you engage them, they're going to want to come along with you that much more. And if you have a great plan that drives their objectives, then they're going to be that much more willing to move with you. And then lastly, again, you need to nail that next step. I talk to a lot of salespeople and I ask them, okay, so what's your next step with this? And they talk to me about what they hope to do or what they plan to do, but neither of those includes the prospect. So again, I think if you have a clear plan for that account, a clear plan for that meeting, and drive towards that. And if you can't get to what you need to get to, then don't hesitate to disqualify it. That guy is not leaving the planet. He'll be there next year. And every salesperson will tell you about the one they finally got after 2 or 3 tries, right? So, but the one thing that you can't recover is time. So salespeople tend to be very liberal with their time. They don't look at it as something tangible. But if they started to look at it as something tangible, then they'd begin to think about, where do I want to invest this time as opposed to where do I want to, waste this time? Because there's only 2 things you can do with it. So again, if somebody is not responding in the way that others have in similar scenarios, and you can't figure out why, so you should try and figure out why. But if you can't figure out why, then I think there's a screaming signal that says this guy is not ready to buy. So park him. I'm not saying dump him or get rid of him or label him a communist or anything like that. It's just not the time. So you got to go out and find someone that it's the time for. And that means you have to prospect. And what those salespeople don't like to do is prospect. So they'd rather spend time with 3 people that it's painfully obvious that they're not going to do anything. But it's better to have those 3 sort of lingering in your pipeline than take them out and realize that I got to go out and prospect. But again, I think if you learn to disqualify, if you're constantly prospecting, because again, one of the problems is the reason they don't want to let go. If their closing average is 4 to 1, and they need to bring in 3 deals in a month, and they only have 8, opportunities, do the math. They're not going to make their numbers. So then they go to hope and pray, and they figure if it's in the pipeline, somehow miraculously, you know, Jesus will smile down on them and they'll get the deal. But that's not the way it works. So I think that if they get rid of the clutter and they focus on what has to happen next, and be brave enough that when the customer doesn't want to take that next step, then they're not a customer. They might be in the future, but it ain't going to happen this cycle. But, you know, salespeople would rather be optimistic than work hard.
Nice. Anna, did you have any we're kind of out of time from what I'm seeing. Do you have any last questions or anything?
No, just I just find that seems to be what I'm hearing a lot of these days, is that salespeople are wasting time on people who aren't ready to buy. And we tend to chase those people down, expecting that if we're good enough, if our sales technique is good enough, that we should be able to convert the customer, when what you're saying is they're sending you signals, they're not ready, you need to find the ones, which means we have to prospect, which a lot of us don't like to hear. A lot of us don't like to have.
They're always looking for buying signals. They're always looking for buying signals, so they'll take, you know, a wink and a smile as a buying signal, right? But I do want to say something, because I don't think that, you know, we're talking about salespeople, but I wouldn't put the issue at their feet. To be fair, somebody's making them do it. I know managers who won't allow their reps to take stuff out of their pipeline, and they're just punishing that guy. I know managers who are not leading from the front; they're just managing from a dashboard. So again, salespeople are human, contrary to popular belief. They're going to respond to the stimulus that's there, right? So if I know that dad's going to like me if I do this, then I'm going to do that. Whether it's right or wrong, I want dad to like me, right? So I think that the fault is not entirely at the feet of the salespeople. I think that their leadership has a lot more to do with it, and it probably is in a much better position to change it than the salesperson individually. So I just want to be clear that I don't see this as being a bottom-up issue. I see it more as a top-down issue.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good point. I was talking to someone earlier today who was talking about how her spouse is in a sales position, and his manager is very micromanaging and just all over him, and, you know, call runs long, and he comes over to see why the guy hasn't closed yet. So I think you're right. There's a lot that our sales managers could do differently that would help out our sales reps substantially. We are pretty much out of time, but Tibor, do you have, first of all, any last words for our listeners? Second of all, if they've been listening to you and they would like to get in touch with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
So the best place in North America, they can dial toll-free 855-25-SALES. Make it easy for the salespeople out there. Or they can hit me by email, which is my first name, Tibor, dot my surname, Shanto, at sellbetter.ca. And if they go there, I have a blog that publishes twice a week, the same one that won the gold medal in, I think, 2013. I think it's still as good, probably better now. So they can do it that way. And I'm all over LinkedIn. I'm not shy.
What was that email address again? Was your first name dot your last name, and what was the website?
Sellbetter.ca. SELLBETTER.ca.
Sellbetter.ca. So I do want to encourage our listeners, if you've been hearing Tibor talk and you really think, you know what, hey, this sounds like I should talk more with this guy, reach out to him. Shoot him an email at tibor.shanto@sellbetter.ca. And you know what I'm going to do for you guys? I'm going to encourage you to go over and join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Black Belt Selling, because what we will do for you guys is we will post that email address in the group. So if you're driving right now, you don't have to be writing that one down. You should be joining our group anyhow, because we're always posting motivational, inspirational, sales training, sales information in that group. Plus, you get the amazing reminder every single week to come join us, where we bring on amazing guests like Tibor. Tibor, thank you for joining us. It was really good to have you. You shared a lot of valuable information today.
Thank you. It was fun.
Well, for our listeners out there, I just want to remind you that once again, your life is in your hands. You have the potential to become a black belt of your life, not just of selling, not just of business, but of your life. Make your life great. I'm Stephanie, here for Anna. We are the Black Belt Sellers of Southwest and Central Texas, encouraging you to go out there, whatever you do, make it a great week.